his election, President Cyril Ramaphosa has constantly faced a barrage of criticism, with his detractors describing him as indecisive and weak. His critics in the business sector have been frustrated with his administration's failure to implement much-needed reforms to steer the economy to growth. All this while he faced a war of attrition inside the party, the ANC. But then, all of a sudden, rapid fire from the president and his allies, not only inside the ANC, but in economic reforms as well. This week's establishment of the new Transnet National Ports Authority as an independent SOE within Transnet is the third major move he's made on the economy in recent weeks. It follows his raising of the threshold for energy self-regulation without licensing to 100 megawatts and the recent sale of 51% stake in SAA to a private sector consortium. So do these moves signal that he's feeling emboldened and in control of the governing party and the state? Well, joining me now for an extensive conversation on some of these moves is the ANC's head of economic transformation, Enoch Godongwana. Thank you for joining me, Mr. Godongwana. So for the longest time, since President Cyril Ramaphosa came into office in 2018, and indeed after the elections, it seemed as if he was being cautious and slow to the trigger. Then all of a sudden, we see these three moves that I just mentioned in a space of about a month. What has changed that has emboldened the president to make these moves now?
Let me start by going back to the State of the Nation in 2019, which is the start of this sixth administration. In that State of the Nation address, the president outlined 5 priorities of this administration, which was the sixth administration. Among others, is inclusive growth. Among the pillars of that inclusive growth is to ensure that there's a competitiveness of this economy and huge structural reforms to achieve, to underpin that growth. What were those structural reforms? Amongst those structural reforms was the electricity issue, in terms of both availability and coverage and access, and also in terms of cost. That's the first structural reform which I want to talk to. The second one is the cost of logistics, which he also mentioned in that speech, which is related here. Thirdly is the issue of telecommunication industry, in particular the spectrum. So I'm highlighting this issue because these 3 ones, they were not the only ones mentioned, but they are the ones who have occupied a center, a space in the discourse. So what has been happening, I suspect, is that President Ramaphosa inherited weak institutions, which made it difficult, both in the form of departments and in the form of the various state-owned enterprises and other agencies, whether you talk about prosecution authorities and so on and so on. So part of the first phase of what he has been doing is rebuilding institutions to be able to deliver on this mandate. So that's what we are seeing at the moment.
So in terms of your reading as the custodian of the ANC's policies on the economy and transformation, as well as the mandate from the branches expressed in the form of the resolutions from the 2017 conference, how confident are you as Enoch Godongwana sitting here now that the president's moves remain within that mandate given by the branches and within those resolutions?
Yeah. Let me say, branches and conference give you a broad policy framework. Correctly so, because branches don't have all the capacities and so on to drill into the detail. Now, it's up to government to try and turn those resolutions into an implementation plan. Now, let me take the generation issue which the president announced. At the moment, we've got a critical shortage of electricity which impacts on the economy over the past few years. A perennial problem as the electricity shortages which impact on growth and the performance of the economy. Attempts are being made to bring new capacity into the grid. Minister Mandashe has announced emergency programs and procurement for emergency programs. But there's agreement amongst all the parties that between now and 2024, we'll still have a shortage. That's the first agreement amongst the parties. The second agreement amongst the parties is that to close that gap, you needed embedded generation. And the president, instead of the nation address, announced that particular part of embedded generation. The debate has been what size, to what extent can you exempt people from the normal application processes. First it was 10 megawatts and there was an argument for 50 megawatts. But Minister Mandashe himself said a couple of other companies, particularly in the mining industry, were looking for about 100 megawatts. That decision, therefore, is to close the gap to make sure that between now and 2024, we can close the gap and deal with the supply challenges in electricity. So that's one of the issues. If you look at the ports issue, the ports issue is that the National Port Authority is the landlord in terms of owning the ports. The argument then, in order for it to gain its independence and allow private operators to compete on an equal footing with the Transnet port terminals, they can't be in the same stable. And that restructuring has been delayed by a number of things, particularly investors worried about how they are going to, if you take the Port Authority out of Transnet and put it as separate, how are you going to service the debt? President Ramaphosa and the team have found an elegant solution to that question. And that is, while they are going to make sure that it is independent from an operational basis, it has got autonomy, but it will still be 100% subsidiary of Transnet.
But overall, though, Mr. Godongwana, the state-owned enterprises are not coming all right, are they? I mean, I don't see a reading that says things have improved with any level of significance in the key problematic state-owned enterprises, which I believe was part of the resolutions and decisions that you took as branches of the ANC at NASREC. But translating that into reality is proving to be quite difficult for the president and his administration.
The impact of state capture has had different effects in different institutions. You will see that where state capture was embedded, it is difficult to come out of the challenges those institutions are facing, whether it's SAA, whether it's TNL, whether is ESCOM. But outside that, there are a lot of state-owned institutions which are operating efficiently and doing their business, day-to-day business. Normally, there are IGCs of this world. I chair the DBSA. There's other institutions which are operating efficiently.
So let's talk a bit about the big contentious one of the announcements by the president recently. The talk of a private equity partner has been part of the conversation since at least around 2015, if I remember correctly. I think when I first heard of it, Malusi Gigaba was still the Minister of Public Enterprises. But my goodness, Mr. Godongwana, I don't recall a conversation in the ANC that talked about the privatization of SAA. So again, I ask, to what extent does a decision like that lead to a situation where the president and his leadership have strayed from what the mandate was. The mandate, for example, would have been go and fix SOEs, including SAA, the national flag carrier, for one reason or another, the ANC being married to the idea of a national flag carrier. But right now, as we speak, this decision, some would suggest, transcends those bounds. It goes to the extent of privatization of SAA, which was, some would say, not mandated.
I sympathize with you when you say you can't recall, and correctly so, you can't recall because you're not a member of the National Executive Committee. Let me take back on this debate. We first confronted this debate on the 6th of January 2019 in Kimberley, when the President presented and Minister Gordon presented the challenges we're facing in respect of SAA. Heated debates have followed for a couple of months dealing with that question. And finally, the NSA decided to look at the state of play in all our state-owned enterprises. We singled out the big ones. In the National Executive of the ANC, 3 presentations were made in that meeting. I made the presentation on the current policy framework and this posture on privatization. And we concluded that there's no policy of the ANC since 1992 which has said no privatization. Why I'm saying since 1992 is because the governing policy in relation to privatization or nationalization is the ready to govern document. What does it say? It says we must be guided by the balance of evidence. I'm making that point because that's the presentation I made in that meeting. In that meeting, Niva Makhetla made a presentation of the state of play, which has been of the study done by TIPS of all the big institutions, and Praveen made a presentation on the SAA and ESCOM. In that meeting, we concluded, and there was an ANC statement to that effect, that insofar as SAA is concerned, government must look for a strategic equity partner. That is, from a policy perspective, that matter was concluded by the National Executive. The rest is a matter of detail. Let me say what is being debated in the public domain. Was there transparency? How much have these people been paid? All of those things are operational detail, which the ANC does not debate. The ANC does not deal with operational issues. Those issues belong to government.
So if I understand you correctly, those who believe that privatization of an entity like SAA, with the majority now being in private hands, majority shareholding, those who criticize that privatization are not in tune with what the position of the ANC is on the issue of privatization. You're saying to me that since 1992, you decided that there's no policy of the ANC that says no privatization.
Absolutely no. Absolutely no. As I'm saying, the guiding principle is the one in the ready to govern document, which must be guided by the balance of evidence. That's the first point. The second point, if we are going to be guided by the balance of evidence, you can't have a blanket position for each and every institution. Each institution will be dealt with on the basis of its own merits. And we decided in the case of SAA explicitly in that National Executive that a strategic equity partner is the necessary thing in the current circumstances.
So let me go back to ESCOM again and talk about that announcement about self-generation. This will allow those private entities and companies that are able to generate their own electricity to generate up to 100 megawatts without needing to be licensed. They would need, of course, to be registered with NERSA, and there's talk of them being able at a certain point to resell some of that excess energy they generate back to ESCOM once there's compliance and everything for the grid. Some have read that as saying, you know, you may not have announced, the president may not have announced privatization of Eskom, but basically it's goodbye to Eskom as the monopoly holder, as the state power generation and distribution company. Welcome the era of private generation of electricity, and possibly you and I buying our electricity from private entities.
Let me say, first and foremost, this is not the first private generation. Okay? We have started from 2010 introducing independent power producers. All of those are private generators. So this exercise is not a new one. It is true that in the long term, you are likely to see competition in the generation sector. There's no doubt about that. Once you allow private generation, therefore, the consequence of such an action is going to be competition in that sector. You will know that the part of the process of unbundling Eskom is to make sure that the transmission is not owned by a competitor. In other words, those generators must not be relying on Eskom. They must be relying on an independent buyer of electricity, which is going to be still 100% owned by the state, which is a transmission company.
Let's move quickly because we are almost out of time. Let's talk about the area where, I mean, we've seen this rapid fire in these announcements that were made recently by the president. But here's an area where you're simply not making enough progress from the mandate that you were given by the branches. When you left Nasrec in December 2017, it was very clear. In fact, your president, President Ramaphosa, used to say that we are going to expropriate land without compensation, whether they like it or not. I do remember hearing those words in his closing remarks there at Nasrec. But you've made no progress, and your term in the ANC is nearly up. It seems to me that the process in Parliament is gridlocked.
There are two ways of evaluating progress. The first one is to evaluate whether the parliamentary process is working or not. For the parliamentary process to evaluate our progress is whether we have the sufficient majority to be able to carry this thing through. The answer is no. And therefore, there's no way that the ANC can push through an amendment of Section 25 without support from other political parties. That on its own includes negotiations. That's the challenge we're facing in Parliament. But be that as it may, the second area that you need to check, are we actually redistributing land as we speak? The answer is yes. So that's we're making progress in that regard. So we need to, at the moment, we're trying to quantify how much land has already been distributed. The last one, President was in Hogesdal recently. There was one in Grahamstown and other areas. So in terms of land redistribution, there's progress which is being made.
But is there a way of salvaging the current Section 25 amendment process that doesn't involve you as the ANC capitulating in as far as your position on state ownership of land, nationalization of land, capitulating to the position of the EFF?
My sense is not an area, the people who are talking to the EFF are different. I'm not one who's talking to the EFF, so I'm not in a position to understand how are the negotiations progressing. But there are a couple of viewpoints which are guiding the ANC. From where I understand, the ANC's starting point is actually land redistribution. Whatever we do is not only to acquire land for the sake of it and be in the hands of the state, is to acquire land for redistribution. That's our strategic thrust. Now, whether those negotiations will undermine the strategic ties, I cannot comment on that. I'm not involved in the discussion.
I'm completely out of time, but let me suggest to you, Mr. Godongwana, that in the process of governing, and as it seems that he's making more and more bold moves in as far as governance and the reforms are concerned, President Ramaphosa is actually creating, at best, adversaries and at worst, enemies. Certainly in as far as the public sector wage bill conversation is concerned, right, as well as the relations with labor. I do suspect that you might, run into problems there. Do you believe that decisions, for instance, around the freeze in salary increases, are some of the decisions that will come back to haunt the president and his leadership when it comes to reporting back to the branches of the ANC and the various constituencies, including Labour, within the tripartite alliance?
Let me express a personal view on this matter. Dan, I'm subject to correction by the leadership of the ANC. It is my own conviction that to say there's going to be a wage freeze for 3 years is not a sustainable position. I'm saying that, and I think there's likely to be a finding consensus between government and the public sector and unions on a middle road. For me, I think that's possible.
All right, let's leave it there then. Thank you for your time there. Enoch Godongwana is the chairperson of the Economic Transformation Committee in the ANC's National Executive Committee. We were just teasing out a number of the decisions that have been announced by President Cyril Ramaphosa recently and weighing them up politically. What are the implications in as far as the mandate given by the ANC branches at their conference in 2017 and how that's translating to governance inside the ANC. You heard his own views at the end there, that he doesn't think that the salary freeze for public servants for 3 years is a sustainable position, and hoping, he says, that there's going to be consensus and a middle ground between those positions there. That was Enoch Godongwana in conversation with me.